We'll now be moving on to our final presentation of the afternoon. Madeline Bacolor will be presenting work on We Won't Move, Filipino and White Struggles with Urban Renewal in San Francisco. This work was advised by Phil Denary with reader Deirdre de la Cruz.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. All right, can you see it okay? All right, yes. Perfect. So as Shelley said, my name is Madeline Bacolor. I'd like to thank my advisor, Phil Denary, as well as my reader, Professor De La Cruz. And this is my project about Filipinos and urban renewal. So I wanted to start with this quote because this sort of encapsulates the goal of urban renewal and urban renewal programs in the United States. So this is a quote by the executive director of the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, Justin Herman, and he said, "This land is too valuable to permit poor people to park on it." Yeah, this is kind of like what started this thesis project. As a bit of an introduction, the US has a history of discrimination against Filipinos and Filipino Americans, including residential exclusion, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And we don't see Filipino neighborhoods like we used to in the 20th century. So I wanted to look into why we don't see Filipinos represented in infrastructure in the same way as we might see Chinatown or Little Italy or something like that. So these photos I have here might be a little hard to see, but this was graffiti on a Filipino-owned business in California that said, "Get rid of all Filipinos or we'll burn this town down." And the second one, it says in very small writing, "Positively no Filipinos allowed." So this isn't a history that we talk about a lot in the United States, but there was discrimination and violence against Filipino populations. All right, so to talk a little bit more about residential exclusion, communities of color and low-income communities, particularly Black communities, have been targeted and displaced. White people have tried to keep their communities white by a variety of methods. So this includes redlining, which you can see in this map here. Part of the red in the north is actually Chinatown, and Manila Town was included in this redlining. So the federal government said this is a hazardous place to invest in. We're not going to provide federal loans for you to buy a home here. And a lot of the residential patterns based on redlining still exist today. When redlining kind of phased out and people realized, oh, this is super racist, they came up with new techniques to be racist. So we saw racially restrictive covenants pop up, which essentially said, if you're the owner of this house, you may not sell this house to a person of color. So these were primarily targeting Black families, but Filipinos were also excluded in these racially exclusive covenants. As racially restrictive covenants kind of fell out of fashion and some were ruled unconstitutional, urban renewal became a new strategy to keep white communities white and move communities of color to other parts of the city. And this was also done through zoning ordinances. So urban renewal, a little bit more on that. Neighborhoods were labeled blighted. This was important rhetoric that was often imbued with ethnic and racial prejudices already, as well as prejudices against the poor. The government was then allowed to seize property from private owners via eminent domain. And then if they gave them just compensation, they were allowed to take that property and turn it over to private redevelopers. And therefore communities were displaced and land was redeveloped. So my research questions are sort of combining these two ideas of Filipinos and Filipino infrastructure and urban renewal. So I wanted to know if Filipino experiences of urban renewal fit into these larger patterns of being targeted because they were communities of color, because they were low income, And I ultimately wanted to know if Filipinos were treated differently than whites. So due to time limits for this project, I decided to focus on two communities in San Francisco. They existed at the same time, they had similar populations, and were both struggling with urban renewal and being targeted around the same time. So first I'm going to talk about Manila Town, and specifically the I Hotel. Manila Town at its peak was around 10 blocks along Kearny Street. It was located between Chinatown and the financial district. And for many white people, including planners and renewal advocates, it was lumped into Chinatown. So there aren't any official maps of San Francisco at the time that identify Manila Town, but it was seen as distinct by the people who lived there. It was home to thousands of Filipinos, some upper estimates as many as 30,000. And this was a generation of Filipinos that we call the manongs. It's an Ilocano word that means brothers or uncles, and it's a term of endearment and respect. These Filipinos were some of the first to immigrate to the United States in the early 1900s. And they were barred from owning property, marrying white people, and a lot of professions. So many of them were farm workers who traveled up and down the coast with the harvests and were not able to accumulate a lot of wealth. So they depended on residential hotels, which were a lot cheaper than a long-term lease on an apartment or buying a home. And the I Hotel was the last remaining residential hotel in Manila Town. So this became kind of the catalyst for the anti-eviction movement among Filipinos. I wanted to show a couple pictures of Manila Town, when it was vibrant and alive. We have here diners at, I believe it was Tino's restaurant, which was one of the kind of pillars of Manila Town. We have some residents in the middle of the I Hotel. It was a community. It was established and people felt safe and protected there. And then this last picture is the I Hotel itself. You can see it on the corner. And I like this picture because you can see kind of the incoming high rises on the horizon of the financial district that were moving in on Manila Town at the time. So ultimately, the I Hotel was destroyed, and this is the site where it once stood. It remained this open hole essentially for over 25 years. The original company did not redevelop it right away, and it ended up changing hands a bunch more times, and no one lived there for a long time. So I'm going to pause on the Manila Town story. We'll come back to it in a little bit. But I want to talk a little bit about Yerba Buena, which was the white neighborhood that I compared Manila Town to. It was also a low income neighborhood. It was smaller, around 4,000 people at its height. Most of the population, as I mentioned, was white, but these were also elderly men, often day laborers, similar economic status and demographics there. Yerba Buena was labeled as a skid row, despite being a safe and comfortable place for the people who lived there. So this was also similar to Manila Town. It was labeled as blighted and dirty, and there was this idea that blight could spread to the rest of the city, so it was dangerous to other property values and needed to be redeveloped. So this picture, I just wanted to highlight really quickly. It shows the shoreline of San Francisco, including Yerba Buena, which is kind of in the front here by the bay. In 1957, you can see that the buildings were relatively low. And then, coming into the 60s and 70s, we see those smaller buildings being replaced by high rises and the expansion of the financial and business district. So my third source was actually a city planning report from the Department of City Planning in San Francisco. This was, it was called the Housing and Neighborhood Conditions Report, and it included their penalty system for determining if a neighborhood was blighted and needed to be redeveloped. So this is the penalty system here. You can see it's kind of small, but the maximum penalty was 89 points. And we have structural, neighborhood, and occupancy characteristics. These purple arrows are some of the characteristics that targeted low-income communities. So especially monthly rent and income was specifically targeting people who didn't make as much money as the median of the city. We also have deterioration rate and dilapidation. They have these weird formulas for how to determine the deterioration rate of a neighborhood, but it was used to target the poor. We also see mixed land use on here under neighborhood characteristics. Both Manilatown and Yerba Buena were mixed land use. And this was actually important for the communities because they had grocery stores, restaurants, barbershops, everything that they needed in their own neighborhood. Most did not have access to cars or other transportation, so they needed all of those things close to home. And of course, I wanted to highlight the penalty that caught my attention first was non-white population. So neighborhoods were penalized for having people of color, and that certainly was targeting the Filipinos of Manilatown. So I wanted to show this picture because urban renewal has a history of violence. And ultimately, the protests around Manilatown resulted in violence. Elderly people and protesters were arrested, and they had these big protests where eviction notices were posted, and there was police brutality. So I think that's something that we also lose sight of with our studies today, is that this happened to Filipino communities as well. In terms of my analysis, government agencies and business interests were pushing for urban renewal and redevelopment. Business interests motivated agencies to redevelop neighborhoods and often were providing funding to get government officials elected who they knew would be in favor of redevelopment. And redevelopment advocates, both in the government and in the private sector, used existing prejudices to justify displacement. So this includes the rhetoric around blight that was targeting minority and low-income communities. And in conclusion, the result of these fights is that thousands of elderly people lost their homes so that the city's financial and business district could expand. We don't see really a lot of evidence of Yerba Buena, the residential community as it was, though there is the Yerba Buena Gardens, so the name is kind of continued. And throughout this research process, I was going back to that question of, do Filipinos belong in this larger narrative of people of color being targeted for urban renewal? And ultimately, I think they do. I think that the Manong generation belongs in the larger environmental justice narrative. And I hope that my project has helped support that argument. Lastly, these case studies can teach us the importance of united communities, and we need policies that support all people, not just the wealthy and white. So my final slide here is, this is the new iHotel. So they actually built a new iHotel with a community center and heritage museum, as well as housing for elderly San Franciscans. It opened in 2005 and continues to run this day. Thank you so much. Are there any questions I can answer?
Great job, Madeline. We have time for a few questions. Phil, please.
Sorry about that. I saw some clapping hands, and I was treating them as raised hands, so I wanted to wait my turn. So, Madeline, the work that you've done, is a description of the social environment in San Francisco, and it seems to me it's based on, and I know from our conversations, a set of assumptions that increasingly in environmental studies, the environment isn't just the environment outside the city in naturalistic areas, but environment includes the urban environment, and the urban environment necessarily includes the social environment. And there's a history in environmental thought of not taking that into account. That's fortunately, for the most part, we now do take that into account. My question is, how does this particular story from this one place, where does it fit into that larger environmental justice conversation and narrative and literature? What did you see here that tweaks our understanding or adds a new wrinkle, or maybe it adds no new wrinkles and that's actually what makes it interesting? But can you say more about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't have time to put more about the environmental justice movement into this presentation, but that is something I covered a lot in my project, as you know. So the environmental justice movement began working with toxic wastes and things affecting neighborhoods where people lived. So the kind of famous example is Warren County in North Carolina, where toxic PCBs had been dumped along the side of the road. And they were trying to site a dump to house these chemicals near a neighborhood, a Black neighborhood, where people were living. So the very beginning of the environmental justice movement was around having a safe place to live. And that's something that the process of urban renewal prevented people from having a safe place to live. Many of the Manongs and the residents of Yerba Buena, they didn't have enough money to relocate to other parts of the city. And there were people who were left homeless. So I think that urban renewal belongs in this larger environmental justice movement, but I also believe that access to housing is a human right. So that is not agreed upon by everyone, but a great professor that I had here at U of M, Dr. Taylor, who now works at Yale, in one of her books about environmental justice, she includes a chapter on urban renewal and how it targeted particularly Black neighborhoods in Detroit and New York City. And so patterns that she identified, I saw in the stories about Manila Town and other Filipino communities.
So maybe taking that sort of a step further, one of the things you said early on is, there's these various stages where it's like, oh, we realized that policy was racist, but now we just came up with a policy that just is slightly less overtly racist. And so, kind of thinking through, sort of the history work that you've done in Manila Town, but then thinking through the various issues of gentrification we see today in our cities. What are some of the through threads that you might see from that sort of are sort of continuing the story, but just maybe not as blatant?
Yeah, so a big one that we talk about a lot in the urban planning field is zoning. So we still see a lot of single family zoning. You have to have half an acre or an acre and one family living on that plot of land, which is more expensive. And so for communities that weren't able to build the kind of wealth or get federal housing loans like white people were, it's unattainable. It's not accessible to be building or buying a home. And so there are many neighborhoods, including in Ann Arbor, where you can't have apartment buildings. And so that's, I think, a big thread now is still trying to keep neighborhoods white, trying to keep the middle and upper class together away from lower income communities. And zoning is one way they do that.
Well, and so it says here that your next steps are planning to work as a research assistant on a project to decolonize Filipino materials and artifacts at U of M, which sounds really exciting. It would be great if you could tell us a little bit more about that project or other plans you have for the future.
Yeah, so Professor De La Cruz, who's actually here with us, is one of the heads of this project. She invited me to be a part of it, and I'm so excited. The U of M has a long and complicated history with colonialism in the Philippines and connections to it. So a lot of collections at U of M include Filipino artifacts, materials, specimen, that sort of thing. So we're trying to uncover not only what all these collections are and what we have, but also how they might be useful or valuable to the community. So we're working with scholars of Indigenous studies, saying how have other communities been able to access or repatriate their materials from universities and museums. And we're looking at how to do that for these Philippine materials. So my family background, my grandfather was from the Philippines and moved to Michigan, specifically so his kids could go to U of M. And so my dad and his siblings all came to U of M. I'm proud to continue that legacy, but it is complicated, the relationship that the university has with the Philippines and with these things that were stolen, 100 years ago. So that's work that I'm really excited about.
It's very exciting work, and so we wish you luck on that project. It sounds like a great one, and wish you luck on all your future endeavors. I'm sure you will go very far. So thank you to all of the student presenters of today. We saw some really incredible work from our honors cohort, which we always expect to because we have amazing students. Thank you for all of the faculty who agreed to be advisors of these projects. For us, often as faculty, it's more rewarding than it might be for you to see your finished work, just to see it come to fruition. But thank you all to the faculty, and I think we all definitely owe a round of applause to Jason Duvall for all of the work that he has done for the honors program. I know the students definitely and totally appreciate you and everything you do, and certainly the program does as well. So that is going to draw our day together to an end. Our graduates, I hope you have a wonderful time celebrating with friends and family over the weekend. Congratulations yet again. You should feel incredibly proud of your accomplishments. And again, be sure to keep in touch. Let us know where you're doing and where you end up in the future, because we always love to hear where you end up. So have a great afternoon and go blue.